TCAM and Mary Angela requested pickup lines that the ladies could use on the guys. Now, normally it's the guys that use the pickup lines on the girls, but I guess I could give a few that, I've heard used on me in my time. So, there's one time where we was going to we were gonna go get some food, and I was like, "Hey, Scarlett, what do you want? What do you want for dinner? Where do you want to go?" And she goes, "I'm in the mood for pizza. A pizza, you." Oh, that one was good. Another time, going to McDonald's, we sat down and Scarlett looked across the table at me and she said, "Mr. Bruce, if you were a burger at McDonald's, you'd be the McHandsome." All right. You're welcome, sixth grade. I know that every day when you open up these videos, this is what you look forward to most. But now it is time that we finish John chapter 19 and finish our unit on the Passion narratives. So I do want to take this time to remind you that John's gospel is different than the other three gospels. John's gospel is not part of the synoptics. And because of that, a lot of details are different. A lot of things that are present in the other gospels are simply not here in John's gospel. So one big difference in this Passion narrative is that, unlike the synoptic gospels, John's gospel does not include Simon of Cyrene. In John's gospel, Jesus carries the cross by himself. Why do you think that would be? Think about it. Why would Jesus carry the cross by himself? Based on what we know about John and the things he likes to emphasize about Jesus, why would it be important for John that Jesus carry the cross by himself in his version of the gospel? Yes, Adam, very good. Because in John's gospel, John wants to emphasize the divinity of Christ, and he does this by showing that Christ is always in control. Right? So Jesus is always in control of the situation in John's gospel. So Jesus carries his own cross. He is controlling the situation. Okay, so Jesus is crucified. And it says, Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Now many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews." But he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." All right. So basically, Pilate it was customary that during a crucifixion, the reason the person was crucified would be put on a sign and nailed above the cross. That way, when people pass by the crucifixion site, they can look at the sign to see why the person has been crucified. Right? This was a tactic that the Romans liked to use to get people to obey the law. Right? Most often, people were crucified because they committed crimes against the state. Usually, they rebelled against the government in some way. Right? And so, if a person was crucified at the top of the cross, it would say something like, it would say the person's name, and it would say this person is crucified because they rebelled against the Roman authorities or something like that, right? Well, when Pilate is having Jesus' inscription made, remember, Pilate doesn't think Jesus has actually done anything wrong. So Pilate puts Jesus' name, Jesus of Nazareth, and then for Jesus' crime, right, Pilate says, "King of the Jews." on the sign. Well, the chief priests don't like this. They want Pilate to change it to say, "This man said, I am king of the Jews." Right? Because they don't want people to think that Jesus is actually a king. Right? They think this gives too much attention to Jesus being a king. Right? And so they asked Pilate to change it, and Pilate says no. Pilate's like, "I'm done with you guys. Right? I did what you wanted. I'm done. I'm not changing anything." Now, many women, including Jesus' mother, are standing at the foot of the cross where Jesus is dying. And it also says, alongside them is the disciple whom he loved. And then Jesus turns to that disciple and to Mary, and he says, "Behold your mother." And then it says the disciple then takes Mary into his home. All right. So who is the disciple Jesus loved? This disciple is John, right? The author of the gospel. And Jesus is telling John and all of us that Mary is now our mother, right? So just like John brings Mary into his life, right, we too are supposed to bring Mary into our lives. This is a command given to us by Jesus on the cross. And as Catholics, we venerate Mary, right? Because we obey this command of Jesus on the cross. Okay, so while Jesus is hanging on the cross, he cries out, "I thirst." So when you're crucified, one of the things that happens is you lose so much blood and water that you start to become very dehydrated very quickly. So Jesus is physically very thirsty, but this is also a cry that he's thirsting for our love for our souls, right? So he both thirsts physically, but he also thirsts spiritually for our love for our souls. One thing that is similar between John's gospel and the synoptic gospels is the way Jesus dies. So in the synoptics, Jesus doesn't die in an ordinary human kind of way. Jesus willingly gives up his spirit, right? His spirit isn't taken from him. Jesus gives up his spirit. Now, normally, when a person is crucified, you have to make sure that, well, if a Jewish person was crucified, normally the Jews would ask that the person be dead before the sun goes down on the Sabbath day. So if you're crucified on the Sabbath day, if you're a Jewish person, the Jewish authorities would make sure that you are dead before the sun goes down. Right? Sometimes when people were crucified, they could be on the cross for many, many hours into the night before they die. But the Jews thought it was really important that the people on the cross were dead before the Sabbath began, because otherwise it would be a violation of the Sabbath laws. Right? And so the Jews asked Pilate to make sure that all of the Jewish people being crucified, including Jesus, have their legs broken. Now, the reason you would want the legs broken on the cross is because the way you die in crucifixion is usually by asphyxiation. Right? You die because you slowly lose your ability to breathe. And what keeps you alive on the cross is the strength in your legs. So when you're on a cross, your legs support the weight of your body and allow your lungs to take in air. Well, if you break the legs, then the legs can't do that anymore. The lungs can't take any more air, and then the person dies by asphyxiation. So normally, Jesus' legs would have been broken, right? Because that's what the Jews want. So the soldiers come and they break the legs of all those crucified with Jesus. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. So when they go to Jesus, they say that Jesus is already dead. And so they don't want to break his legs, because breaking someone's legs, the way the Romans did it, required them to swing a gigantic hammer really, really hard at the person's legs to break them, to break the bones. And that's kind of a lot of work. So when they saw that Jesus was already dead, they decided not to break his legs, and instead they would pierce his side with a spear, right? And, see if Jesus would react to it, right? To make sure he's dead. So they stab him in the side with a spear, and blood and water pour out of the side. Right? So why is it significant that Jesus' legs are not broken? Well, it's because the Jewish law says that the sacrificed lamb should not have its bones broken. Remember, Jesus is being paired up here with the sacrificial lamb that the Jews use at the Passover. And according to Jewish law, if a lamb is to be sacrificed, it cannot have any broken bones. So the fact that Jesus' bones are not broken demonstrates that he is our paschal lamb, our sacrificial lamb. Finally, Jesus is buried in a tomb, which John tells us is in a garden. And John also tells us no one has ever been laid in this tomb before. It's a brand new tomb. Right? Now, why is it a garden? Well, this is a reference to the Garden of Eden. Right? Why is it significant that no one had ever been laid in this tomb? Well, this is a reference to Mary's virgin womb, right? Which had never contained anyone else, right? Mary's womb had never had a child in it when Jesus was in there, right? So Mary had a virgin womb. Jesus was buried in a virgin tomb. All right, that's it. See you later.